Hey everyone, welcome to What About Grief? I'm Larry Holm. So often when we're talking about grieving and loss, the idea of moving on seems to come up. And moving on from grief assumes that you're able to achieve a kind of closure, like closing a door or finishing a chapter. No one actually told me to move on when my wife Sarah passed away, but I did get the sense at times in speaking with various people that they would circle around the moving on terminology and just present it to me in different ways. I would think to myself, hey, come walk in my shoes and understand the emotions and feelings I'm experiencing right now, and you tell me if I'm ready to move on. But what happens when a person is mourning a loss with no clear resolution and no closure? Like dealing with a loved one diagnosed with Alzheimer's or any dementia-related illness. Like searching for a military family member who has been declared MIA. Or like simply losing contact with someone through estrangement. It's an emotional limbo. My guest today is Dr. Stacey Pinatelli, and her recent article in Psychology Today magazine titled, "What It Means to Grieve Someone Still Living," describes a type of grief that is rarely acknowledged and often misunderstood, and I would guess probably touches more people than you and I can imagine. It is called ambiguous loss. Dr. Pinatelli is a pre-licensed psychologist with a PsyD in clinical psychology. Her clinical work focuses on trauma, PTSD, serious mental illness, and supporting clients experiencing ambiguous loss. So with that, Dr. Pinatelli, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
In doing research for this episode, I did come across your article and the description of ambiguous loss as a form of grief. And I was wondering if you could just kind of unpack it for us, this term ambiguous loss and how it evolved.
Okay, absolutely. The term's actually been around for quite a while. In the 1970s, Dr. Pauline Boss came up with that term, and she really focused on how to describe these losses that just don't seem to have the same clarity or closure that, say someone you lose to death does. That term, however, although it's been around for a really long time, it's now just starting for people to understand what that really means. So we're really talking about what you said, Larry. When someone's not present, maybe it's, they're psychologically absent, maybe their cognition is not what it used to be, or even when someone's not physically present, like an estrangement. But I think for me, the way that I see it now as in its evolving is that it captures this, I like the term frozen grief. It's like what you said, where you can't really move forward or backward. You're just kind of in this limbo. That's how I would describe ambiguous loss.
In an interview I read with Dr. Boss, she said there's two types, physical and psychological ambiguous loss, right?
Yeah, so when she's terming that, she means physically, there's a physical loss when someone's, not present, right? But you're still feeling that, you're still grieving that person that's still living, but maybe not in your life anymore. And the psychological loss can happen when, you're maybe caregiving and taking care of someone who is not necessarily the same as they used to be. There is some psychological loss there as well.
And what is someone feeling when they are experiencing ambiguous loss? Because oftentimes death is not part of the story, correct?
It is oftentimes not. And, it's very similar to what we would experience when we grieve, but there's a huge difference here. It's like because there's no closure, there's a sense of confusion, and what I see a lot in the clients that I've worked with is not just the confusion, but a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. When I would speak to clients about it, they would say, well, I don't have the right to feel this because this person's still here. So there's a grieving for someone who's here, but then they're not the same. So I think there's a sense of loss without closure that can make these emotions that come up feel really confusing and contradictory.
Yeah, maybe because do they feel guilty because they weren't able to say the things that they wanted to before maybe that terminal loss kicked in, or the memory from Alzheimer's is gone, right? That person isn't the same.
Exactly. And then they feel guilty for even feeling those things, especially if they're, a caregiver, for example. and they want to connect with the person, and they just aren't able to connect in the same way that they did before. And I think it brings up a lot of feelings of, feeling a little bit invalidated by others, because people look at this grief as, well, it's not real because this person's still here. So why are you so sad?
Are there other types of grief that you can have while someone is still living?
Absolutely. There's another term that I think I talked about in the article, anticipatory grief.
Right.
And that is, when we know that this person is eventually not going to be here anymore, and you're starting to feel what it's going to be like when this person isn't here anymore, but you still are in that frozen state of grief. You're not able to really process it. And, some people say, well, at least clients have told me that, family members might say, well, at least they're still here.
Mm-hmm.
At least you have time. But when you're feeling that frozen state, it's really hard to navigate the even thought of them not being here anymore.
Yeah.
They're still holding on to hope and love and all of those things, and they're trying to grieve in the best way they can. So it feels really unresolved, even if they're anticipating that this is the outcome.
Yeah, I think I can relate to anticipatory grief because my wife battled cancer for 21 months. And I think for 20 of those months, I was always in the stage of trying to stay positive, that let's have some hope. I guess I didn't want her to see maybe my sadness, but I also, inside felt like, okay, she survived death once early on in her cancer battle, and maybe it will come back around again. But then that last month when, the emergency brain surgery came in because of a tumor there, and then her last time in the hospital, I kind of felt like I was giving up that hope. And I started to think about losing my wife, the wife I loved, about life without her and next steps and being alone and my future and what that even looked like. I felt like that's when my anticipatory grief kicked in. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Larry. I can totally relate with that feeling. Experiencing the same thing with my mom's loss, knowing the time was coming, knowing hospice was happening. It didn't really register until like what you just described. Like at that moment when you're thinking, what is my life going to be like?
Yeah.
And that is a really difficult place to be in. And the grieving process, I feel, is a little bit even compounded after they're gone, because you're already experiencing those feelings prior to the loss.
Yeah. Let me just jump back to ambiguous loss for a moment. How do we interact or try to figure out how we need to be when there is a Alzheimer's patient that we're dealing with, or dementia, or whatever it may be? How do we live day to day with that?
So it's incredibly hard for caregivers because they're grieving in real time. So I think the beginning part of how do we manage it, how do we juggle it, is to really give yourself permission to feel the love and the loss all at the same time. And I know that that is easier said than done. So it's really important to establish other support systems outside the home, focusing on taking breaks, and to remember that you're caring with compassion, not perfection. And what I mean by that is when we're taking care of someone, we often try, or we think that we need to do it perfectly to, ensure their comfort or their happiness. But that doesn't give us a lot of room for self-compassion. So my take on this is that while you're grieving, understanding that presence matters more than the performance. And I can clarify that if you need to, what I mean by performance.
Well, go ahead, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, I felt like it was a little ambiguous now that we're using that word. When we're with that person, that matters more than what we do or don't do, because we need to be compassionate that we're grieving this process while we're also trying to take care of someone, especially in the case of Alzheimer's or dementia.
Yeah. For me, I was my wife's caregiver, and I loved being her caregiver. In a way, it was an honor to be her caregiver. But to your point, I was trying to be perfect and doing the checklist, laundry, cooking, getting her to appointments, and all of this, right? And trying to do my normal 9 to 5 job. And I would just like collapse at the end of the night when she would finally get to bed and take that last piece of medication. And I just felt like I was just going through the motions trying to have her not worry about anything. But really one thing I regret is that I really didn't talk to her much about what was actually going on in her head and dealing with cancer and what were her thoughts and was she scared? Like I feel bad about that now. I look back at that, and doing the laundry might have not have been the most important thing, I could have done that day. So I can relate.
Circling back to that, Larry, my question to you would be, when you were doing that and trying to be perfect, what was your motivation for that?
I just wanted her to be comfortable and not have to worry about anything, and rest and prepare mentally for PT or going to the doctors or getting radiation or whatever it was that day. I just wanted her not to worry about anything, that, hey, I am here and I will take care of everything. But I realized I wasn't Superman, and what I most regret now are those conversations that could have taken place that would have lived with me in a really, I think, good way, instead of, like I said, just doing checklists, doing the dishes, doing whatever it was.
Yeah, and you're bringing back up to the ambiguous loss, those feelings of guilt,
Right.
feelings of sadness, all compound what you were trying to do. You were trying to make sure everything was comfortable and that she didn't have to worry about anything other than just being okay and healthy.
Yeah. Is that pretty common?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it not just with, taking care of someone with a chronic illness. I see it in the sense where even if it's an estrangement, they'll talk about how they tried to do everything perfectly. They tried to make this relationship better or worthy of holding on. And so even though it didn't, they're still experiencing all those feelings that you're talking about. Still questioning and feeling guilty for things that they did or didn't do, or feeling blamed, even if there's really no blame to be had in those cases. Sometimes people just, leave our lives for reasons that are out of our control.
Yeah. There's no perfection in grief, really.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I read about as well in that interview with Dr. Boss was about attachment theory and continuing bonds. And I guess for me, maybe it might be the attachment theory. And I'm wondering if you can kind of break down those, or maybe that's the continuing bond. I'm not sure. Can you kind of break down those two definitions?
Yeah, attachment theory is really based on understanding that the bonds that we form with loved ones don't really disappear when they're gone.
Yeah.
Right? So they just kind of transform. And when I say gone, I don't necessarily mean in death. I mean when the loss is ambiguous and they're still here. So this is happening prior to them being gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're either emotionally or psychologically or physically gone. But they're still alive, and yet not in the same way that we were attached to them before. So our attachments that we make with people are often based on, needs, wants, desires. But when, in the case of somebody that's ill, those bonds are still there, but the attachment has shifted. It's changed. And so that brings us to the concept of continuing bonds. It's reframing grief not as something to get over, but a way that we can evolve the relationship with the person who's gone. And our connections take many forms. We can still stay connected to someone through, memory or, doing some rituals, or even just what you were talking about, Larry, those small daily thoughts that you still have about your wife, and just kind of honoring their presence in our lives. That's a continuing bond. It's still happening even when the person is no longer present.
Can continuing bond, though, be a bad thing in that you're still not moving on from that person? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it holding us back?
Can you elaborate a little when you mean holding you back?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get married again, or I feel like if I do this, that person might not agree with me, or I don't know. I mean, can people get stuck that they're still attached to a person who isn't with us anymore?
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually glad you brought that up because, attachment can be a helpful thing, but it can also be a very unhelpful thing if we're too attached, is what I'm hearing you say. If we're
too
holding
attached
on, just trying to keep that person with us, then you're absolutely right. That attachment can lead down a path that is not as helpful for you. And it's not about letting go. It's really about learning how to hold differently, learning how to navigate with these changes and allow the grief that you feel, but also giving yourself space to heal, to find new meaning, and to even make ongoing connections in other ways. So you're right, Larry, when that happens, it can be like you're stuck.
You're listening to the What About Grief podcast. We will get back to the conversation in a moment, but I wanted to remind you that you can write to us at the show with your thoughts, ideas, or a description of your own grief journey. We appreciate hearing from you, and we like being connected with our listeners. So please reach out to us via email at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com. Also, if you like the podcast and find it helpful, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating, hit the subscribe button, and leave a review. All of this helps us grow the podcast and helps new listeners find the show. And share the link with those you know who are experiencing their own grief. The goal of the podcast is to help those like us navigate the confusing emotion that is grief. I read that the pandemic contributed a wave of ambiguous loss for many people in society. Can you describe in what way it did that?
Oh, yeah. The pandemic really magnified this kind of loss because people didn't just lose loved ones to illness or death. We all lost, daily routines, the connections we had with other peoples in the community, or even just simple life things that we did every day that gave our life structure. And during that pandemic, we were also separated by our friends and families without the usual rituals. Like, some people couldn't have graduations or couldn't attend funerals or weddings, and any of the things that actually help us process grief and feel closure. So there was a lot of uncertainty and separation without the typical rituals that help us process loss. So I think that this created an ambiguous loss on a massive scale because people were really grieving things that didn't have a clear ending or explanation, like our disrupted plans, our inability to even attend our children's weddings. There was just this absence of physical presence. That uncertainty and the lack of support really amplified why this loss is so invisible at times. So even though the emotional impact can be profound, it's often not seen. It's invisible.
And with the pandemic over and people getting back together, going to school, graduations, parties, what have you, could it be hard for people to get out of that rut that they experienced during the pandemic of being isolated?
Yes, I'm glad that you asked that because what I see oftentimes, and I think I'm a little guilty of it too, is that it changed also how we socialize. It changed for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people, it changed how you interact, how you connect. And, for some people, that is still happening, even, 5 years later, having difficulty, socially interacting because those connections were severed for such an extended amount of time.
You, in your article, described losing your mother, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
And the support you received from people all around you. And I'm wondering why you think maybe ambiguous loss is dismissed by others.
Blatantly, it doesn't fit our scripts for grief, because when someone dies, there's a funeral, there's natural condolences. We're like given permission to grieve. But with ambiguous loss, we don't really get the same acknowledgement. And this leaves people to feel unseen or isolated. And I think it's dismissed because it's people just don't know how to respond when it doesn't make sense. But when someone dies, they're, fully able and capable to give you that support that you need. And when I talked about my mother, I experienced that anticipatory grief and I felt really alone. I didn't really feel like I was getting the support or the space to mourn what was coming. Um, but then it felt really odd because when she did pass, it was an overwhelming sense of support.
Mm.
And it made me think about all other people that experience this ambiguous loss, the anticipatory grief, all of these things that are happening, but yet they don't feel supported in the same way that you oftentimes do when someone passes. It makes it very complex to navigate. And I think that's the clinical part that comes out for me is really helping people understand that their feelings of isolation and their feelings of not being heard are very, very valid.
It seems like, and I'm no expert like you, but it seems like we have to apologize for our grief in society. Do you hear that a lot?
I've experienced it myself and hear it
Yeah,
a lot. And I'm going to take that further. It's not that you just have to apologize. It's almost like there's a time stamp on it.
right.
Like, wait, why are you still sad? Why are you still grieving? Why can't you move on? Like you hear all these things that people, really are trying to be helpful. But when someone's grieving, it's not helpful.
Yeah,
There's no roadmap for grief.
right. Yeah,
And it comes in waves.
sure does.
So I think that lack of acknowledgement can really leave people feeling unseen and then guilty, bringing back that guilt, right, for grieving something that people just don't seem to understand. I mean, even in a typical, and then when I say typical, I mean when someone passes, there's all of these rituals we do, and then they're like, okay, wait, now you're done. Checkbox, checkbox. Oh, you should be done grieving now. And that doesn't happen in a linear fashion for any form of grief.
In your article, you talk about letting go of the idea of closure, and we probably think that the physical death is the closure, but I'm wondering your thoughts on closure of grief, closure of the person who passed away, and all of that.
Well, in my work, I really focus on encouraging letting go of that idea of closure because our goal isn't to, quote, get over it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I think it's about learning to live with the loss and to carry both the grief we feel and the love that we feel. Trying to find, ways to find peace, even when the story may be unfinished. And in some ambiguous losses, you can never have that closure. Especially in the case of estrangement,
Mm-hmm.
there may never be a moment to have that conversation and to really get the closure you need. So I do think letting go of closure allows us just to acknowledge the reality of this type of loss without being trapped by the expectation that we have to have it like tidy and a nice ending.
Mm-hmm.
There's no clear ending with ambiguous loss.
And what a weight off your shoulders, right? That it's okay not to have closure.
It is, but I will say that it is very difficult for people to understand that conception because our brains want closure.
Right.
Our brains want to have some sense of control.
Mm.
So it's really hard for someone to transition to that stage of like, okay, I'm not going to have this. That doesn't mean I don't have control. It just means that I'm not getting lost in this expectation that I have to have this perfect ending to this story.
You've mentioned a few times in our discussion already the word rituals, and I'm wondering if you can describe the importance of rituals as a way of coping.
So small rituals can help. And when I say rituals, it's going to be different for each person, but it can be as simple as lighting a candle, journaling, or just taking a quiet moment to acknowledge what's missing in your life at that moment. And the importance of rituals is that these can provide real comfort when you're not feeling very certain about what you're feeling. I think it's also important to seek out the people who truly get it, whether that's a support group, a friend, a counselor, just someone who's familiar with ambiguous loss. Being understood And I want to say that again, it's not about moving on. It's about being understood, because that piece right there can really help someone ease their loneliness or any feelings of guilt that they're experiencing.
I attended a 13-week grief group about a year after my wife passed away. And to your point about understanding, they got me and I got them, right? Like, we're total strangers. I never would have probably met these people, obviously, if Sarah hadn't passed away. But after these 13 weeks, we still meet up like once every month or 2 months to get together for dinner. And, we'll sometimes go down that grief route. And they get it. They understand me. I can talk freely. They can talk freely. There's no judgment zone. And it's so comforting to still have some of these people in my life.
And that's wonderful, Larry. And I'm glad that you're sharing that piece. I think support groups are not advocated for as much as they should be. What I'm imagining that when you went to that group, you noticed that each person was at a different stage of their grief.
Yep.
And that was okay. That was entirely okay. And when you're in that moment where you're like, wait a minute, it's okay that I'm not here. And when this person is in a different stage and where we can all connect and still have each other's back without all of the judgment. And that's a very powerful, powerful healing tool for people, especially when they're dealing with grief.
Yeah, it's tough to... Like, the first time I drove into the parking lot, I sat in my car and I'm like, do I want to get out here and do this? I debated it for a few minutes, and you just have to be bold, knowing that it could very much help you, but you won't know until you take that first step and give it a few classes. And if it's not for you, that's okay. But for me, it was so much of a comfort. And like I said, I look forward to getting together with some of my grief group members who are friends now, which is really great.
And you bring up the other ritual we were talking about is making meaningful connections, which can be often hard to do. So for you, the grief group helped navigate that for you in a meaningful way.
Yeah. No, I mean, we all talked. We decided, let's get together because we want to continue on. And so, like I said, sometimes we'll talk about grief, sometimes we won't. But it's just the comfort of knowing that they're there, they get me. And, it is a no judgment zone. And I know I've said that a couple of times, but that's really the big comfort.
I absolutely agree. What I've seen most often being the most difficult thing for people to overcome is the judgment. It's why are you feeling this way? You shouldn't feel this way. This person's still here. All of those things that are said can bring up some really impactful feelings of there's something wrong with me. And when you're dealing with grief, that's the last thing you really want to hear, is that there's something wrong with how you're going through the process.
Yeah, it's so individual.
It's absolutely individual. We cannot compare our grief to someone else's grief because we all move at different paces. And sometimes we may, like I said, feel great and then feel guilty for feeling great.
Yeah. And in your experience, what are some ways a person can learn to cope with ambiguous loss?
I think coping with ambiguous loss starts with giving yourself permission to feel, just being okay with whatever it comes up. Some days people feel really sad, while other days people feel like, oh, I'm finally in this acceptance mode. And then they bounce back into, feeling that grief. As we mentioned earlier, those waves, kind of riding with the wave. And that starts by naming that this doesn't really have a linear fashion. And I think with that acceptance, over time, people will start to feel a little less confused because they start to understand that this loss is valid. This is a real type of grief. And it's important, I think, and it doesn't always happen in everyone's case, but I think it's important to try to seek out people who really get it. Whether that's a support group or a friend, or maybe even somebody that's experienced this type of loss before, because being understood really can ease that loneliness.
Speaking of loneliness, we're a few weeks away as we record this from Thanksgiving and all the other holidays that lead up to the new year. And I'm
Hmm.
just wondering, in your just experience as a professional, what advice would you give someone who's grieving, whether it's 2 weeks old or 10
Hmm.
years old, how to deal with the holidays and grief?
Yeah, the holidays can intensify this type of grief. So I think the most compassionate thing I would suggest is to kind of plan ahead. Decide which traditions still feel meaningful, which ones you might want to change, and which ones that you may not want to do at all. And give yourself permission to reduce that pressure of what comes up in the seasons. And when I say that is, we all have our traditions that we like to do for the holidays. And sometimes you feel like, oh, I need to do this because I need to, honor this person in that way. Um, but that can be difficult for people, right, that are experiencing this type of grief. So I think wi- it depends. So if we're talking about coping with estrangement, the person's no longer there, for example.
Hmm.
They're alive, but they're not in your life. I think that means really acknowledging that, you know, this person is no longer here, but I can still have this like moment of reflection and I can allow that feeling while still holding whatever emotional boundaries I need to hold because that, relationship was causing harm or whatnot. But with, someone that's dealing with a chronic illness or even dementia, and you're approaching the holidays, I think that it's simplicity, like focusing on sensory comfort for the person in your life, maybe familiar music or, um, favorite scents,
Hmm.
rather than focusing on conversations or things that may not be possible for that person at that moment. Go back to what I said, it's about being present, right?
Yeah.
And making those small moments that can create further connection in even when the relationship is not what it may have been before.
So if my wife loved going to Hawaii, can I go to Hawaii over the holidays? Is that okay?
Absolutely. I think that's good for your soul too.
There you go. Okay, you gave me that. Okay to do that. Thank you. um, well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and kind of breaking down and helping us learn about ambiguous loss because it was kind of new to me in reading about it and studying it. It really is prevalent in society, but not really known about.
Yeah, as a clinician, I'm really happy that it's starting to become more commonplace. Years ago, I, I know that Dr. Pauline Boss created this term, but I didn't even know,
Hmm.
what that really was, what it meant. And I feel like it's as we bring it more to the forefront, it's going to be more acceptable for us to grieve whatever losses that we're experiencing and not feel so shameful or so guilty or confused for feeling the grief when someone's still here.
Well, Dr. Pinatelli, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts about this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
With the approaching holidays, it can be a really hard time for those of us experiencing the loss of a loved one. Grief may come and ambush you during these couple of months more than in any other time of the year, naturally so. Early on, the way I got through this was putting on and wearing that protective grief mask out in social gatherings, where you look fine to the outside world, but underneath that invisible mask, your heart and spirit are crushed by your grief. You feel lost, alone, unsure, and you just want to return to that life you had before your loved one passed on. You just have to take it easy on yourself. As I have shared numerous times on this podcast, I always return to the daily meditations I find from the book Healing After Loss by Martha W. Hickman. I hope you find this meditation helpful during the holidays. Here's what she writes. Particularly at this time of year when families are celebrating the holidays, the sudden small reminders, and the large ones too, come to plague us. We thought we were doing so well, and then there we are, crying as though our loss was yesterday. We need to take heart. If our loss is recent, the sadness is understandably overwhelming. If it was a while ago and we thought we were over the worst, then perhaps this time it will not take so long for the quiet joy to reassert itself, the spiritual presence to return in its quiet and infinitely precious way. Our life runs in seasons, as does our grief. Some seasons are long, some short. But if we are resolute in our efforts to be present to the moment, even as we know this moment will give way to another, we can be assured at these times of renewed pain that things will get better. And by the way, if you are experiencing grief during the holidays or might not know how to handle it, I'll revert you back to November of 2023 in our episode with Professor Suzanne Deggs-White entitled When Grief and the Holidays Collide. She gave us some really good understanding and some tips on how to deal with the holidays and your grief. I would suggest you go check it out and give it a listen. And remember, if you are experiencing grief, you are not alone. My thanks to Dr. Stacey Pinatelli. What About Grief is available monthly on all major podcast listening platforms. Please follow the podcast as well as rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. The executive producer of What About Grief is Marcia Anderson. Logo artwork was designed by TED Studios. This episode was recorded at BAM Studios in Chicago. And lastly, feel free to email us at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com.